Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Kyte Talks. My name is Trevor Asha and I'm the director at Kyte. Today we talk about PCI DSS, which is a topic which is very close to my heart. We've been doing PCI for the best part of 18 years, and over the years we have had the opportunity to take part in presentations and events talking about the subject. But today I'd like to delve a little bit deeper and get into the more technical details on the subject, especially because in this particular case I believe the devil is in the detail. Today I have three new guests with me. Between them they have many years of doing PCI work, and I'll proceed to introduce them. Kevin Campbell, who is the head of PCI here at Kyte and our leading expert on PCI. We have Conrad Laus, who is the head of information security at RS2, and Gabriel Sultana, who is the CTO at AppCopay. Guys, thank you very much for accepting my invitation to join us on this talk. And yeah, between you all, like I said, you have a lot of experience and you work on PCI on a daily basis. So I believe today we're going to have a very interesting discussion. For sure, we're in very good company. Okay, the first question, let's say introduction to the subject for you, Kev, a warm-up question, let's say. We know that we know the definition of what PCI applies and to who, right? PCI applies to anyone that is processing, storing, or transmitting card data. But in more, let's say, practical terms, why do we need PCI? Why do we continue being asked to comply to PCI? And what are the challenges you as an auditor especially you see on a daily basis?
Okay, so try to answer your first question, if I remember it exactly. So why do we need PCI? If I take it from a point of an organization needing PCI, if they're handling card data, or they need to show to their clients or to the brands, or their clients for that fact, that they are handling card data in a secure manner and way, then yes, you would need PCI from that point of view.
Yeah. And let's say day-to-day basis, seeing tens and tens of clients doing PCI assessments, any common issues you find?
Yeah, the common issue I find in some are possibly scans. They can be challenging for some, the external ASV scans. So approved scanning vendor, checking all the endpoints for the environment itself. And then if you don't have a scan in that quarter, because PCI requires you to have quarterly scans, if you miss a quarter, then you can't rewind time and then get another scan. So yeah, it does show some challenges in that point of view.
You mentioned endpoints, so obviously we cannot not get into the subject of the scope, right? And the scoping, as far as PCI is concerned, we always say scoping is the most important part of the PCI project. But more than that, there are rules to scoping, right? And we've mentioned it on other talks as well, where we spoke about ISO. There's a scope to be defined. DORA, there's a scope to be defined. But when it comes to PCI, the scoping rules are a bit different. Maybe a bit of an introduction, and then we move into other things, and to the actual how the scope is defined as far as the PCI rules go.
Yeah. So just to kind of put it in perspective, where you have ISO 27001, you can define that scope based on a function or an operation or a unit within your business or organization. But where you have PCI and scope, it's basically the processes, technology, and people and where you're handling card data. So basically, you have to define that and see where those processes are and what's handling card data, and that would be in your scope of PCI.
Yeah. Conrad, based on that, let's say, definition of the an auditor's view of, let's say, of the scope, but you have to deal with the issue of scope, obviously, from the implementation side. So how difficult or how easy is it to define the scope when you have a complex environment? Remembering that obviously you have cloud environments, on-prem servers or serverless, you have virtualized environments, multi-sites. How complex does this get? And how do we define the scope in this case?
Okay, so at face value, it can be quite complex because today, for example, with cloud, with people geographically dispersed, for example, and PCI itself, which is quite complex as the list of requirements that we need to comply with, kind of. It can be very complex in the beginning. But of course, in line with what Kevin was saying, if you look at your sensitive data and you say, okay, how am I going to make sure that this sensitive data is very well protected at all costs? I mean, this is the jewels of the crown, if you will. So we try to identify all the assets that would be involved, okay? And I'm not just talking about technology. Everything that is an asset should be considered. Even a process is an asset, for example. The people are assets as well, and how they can all contribute to make sure that whatever is ring-fenced within the scope, okay, is well protected, kind of. So that we define that ring fence first, okay, the boundaries, and then that makes it become, so to speak, a complex exercise that becomes more manageable, because once you have the scope, then you can look at the requirements and apply them properly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits, obviously, of defining the scope is that you can reduce the scope if you so wish, right? Because then you make your job easier in terms of compliance. But it's not always possible. So one of the things I usually say is, like, when it comes to scoping, it's like drawing a dotted line around your infrastructure, which is the part that is in scope of PCI. But it's not as easy as that, right? Because of the interconnections and APIs and again, you mentioned something very important, which is taking an inventory of your assets and stuff, but the connectivity aspect sometimes is a bit harder than just drawing a dotted line.
Yeah, and it keeps getting better, because at the end of the day, whatever is within that ring fence is what is driving the business. So if you have a new requirement which comes in, we need to make sure that you reach a compromise level, so to speak, where you need to provide the service to the client, and obviously the more services you expose, the risks become higher, kind of. So yeah, I mean, it's when we take that into consideration in terms of scope, that's very important and very challenging.
And just out of curiosity, and Gabriel, feel free to jump in as well, do you ever choose not to implement something or implement it in a particular way just so that the scope does not get affected?
That's what, sorry.
It's all right. As in reality, I think I think nowadays it's essentially more easier to align to kind of the scope, in the sense, if you start off with how the data is flowing from the outside in, and obviously how the card data is flowing, and you take like a layered approach on how you can actually contain and ring fence this information. I think nowadays there are various tools and approaches that one can adopt into making sure that this fence basically is defined, and obviously it's giving you the necessary reassurances around these fans. Normally, I believe, again, from the people process technology aspect, the people is the more challenging one because, and obviously ties to the processes part. Because in terms of technology, again, I think nowadays we have a plethora of approaches we can adopt to actually secure the card information and make sure that it is handled in the right way. But when it comes to peoples and processes, usually it's much more challenging, right? So going back to your question in sense of whether sometimes we think of, I believe that I prefer the other approach in saying, okay, how can I adopt more layering to make sure that I'm in line? And typically, perhaps because of my technical background, I prefer having a more technically enabled, technology-enabled approach for this layer. I try to keep the people and processes to the minimum as much as possible. So,
yeah, very good. Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned, yeah, the let's say the challenges, but from an operational point of view. Now, both yourself and you, Conrad, both of you are operating within an environment that is now PCI compliant and certified, right? But getting there probably was not that straightforward at the beginning, even if possibly you might have inherited an environment. But at least for the benefit of those watching us, what would be the challenges, let's say, that you possibly have faced and others could face in the implementation part of preparing your organization, your infrastructure, and your people for PCI compliance?
In my case, in our case, as an organization, one of the key elements is awareness, right? Making sure that everyone within the organization who in some way, shape or form can have an impact on compliance requirements is involved. Because like that, it's you avoid the cat and mouse chase, kind of, whereby on the 11th hour you get to find out that something is going out to production, for example, and it comes to security. I mean, I'm sure it happens to everyone, and it's like, can you check whether, so, and unfortunately that's the way this has to be avoided. And so we try to use the different approach where the opposite, where we try to push people to think PCI whatever they need to do from day one, because like that we get involved from day one, not from day
Absolutely.
Whenever.
I believe the PCI Council calls exactly what you said business as usual, right? In terms of like making PCI something of a daily routine.
Yeah. Because we have an audit, once a year, and then they will come and they will just sign off our papers, and it's not how it works.
And that's exactly the reason why what Kevin mentioned at the beginning, where some people, for example, forget to do certain tasks.
Yeah.
Not just scans, but it could be other things like a review of firewall, review of access rights, review of whatever the PCI requirements require at a point in time. And they miss them, and then they obviously can't go back simply because they're just looking at PCI a few days, weeks before the assessment itself. And I think we can all agree that is absolutely not the way to do it, right?
Exactly.
Actually, it's, as you mentioned, Conrad, it's a much more of an educational approach. It shouldn't be considered as a foreign body to the organization. I think it's part of, I would say, the company processes that need to be endorsed at all layers. And basically, you need to really have I would say, a good education regime, an ongoing education regime, whereby basically even your process, how you're designing processes, you are making sure to be basically, in simple terms, is you say what you do and you do what you say. And I know it's a very simple sentence, but believe me, it's a headache. More importantly, because obviously companies change, processes change, you have new people joining, other people, leaving, etc., etc. So it makes it more challenging and dynamic, right? So honestly, I think we have reached a point where I believe that actually you need to tool up tool up in terms of having actually a system that can guide you and making sure it's like your watchdog to make sure that certain things are not slipping. Because again, the value of I would say the audit, in reality, the audit it should be the final check, right? It should be embedded as part of your day-to-day routine, right? It's an accepted company process. And I think something that we refer to moving forward in the PCI DSS for like niceties, kind of acknowledging the scope and having senior management buying on the scope reinforces the engagement and commitment of PCI within the organization.
And I think another thing what's important for Conrad and Gabriel mentioned is that it's important that individuals who's part of the PCI scope and what jobs they're doing, people know what they're supposed to be doing for the PCI environment. Because sometimes you get in and some people are not quite sure who's doing what or what kind of what they need to complete a task. So it's important that that's introduced in there as well.
Well, I think it's obviously nobody's saying it's an easy task, but based on what you're saying, making it something of a daily thing, it does get easier, right? The more you implement, the more you put the processes in, the more tools you implement, it does get easier. Okay, getting into maybe some of the more technical controls, and we're going to, as I said at the beginning, we are going to get a little bit more technical. So incident response, penetration testing, and some of the other more technical requirements. How are you scheduling these activities? Are they done specifically for, let's say, the PCI compliance aspect of it? Are you integrating it with your overall strategy? Are they scheduled in a way to be done according to, based on what you've just said, I know that the answer is no. You're not scheduling it specifically for PCI compliance and to coincide with the assessment. But how are you approaching the subject of these technical controls, let's say?
So first of all, going back to do what you say and say what you do part. So basically, in terms of anything which is committed as part of our regular kind of upkeep, these are actually scheduled as scheduled tickets that the target personnel have to actually follow. So we are trying to avoid someone has to remember about a process, but actually have like this scheduler watchdog to actually say, look, by this date we should have this, we should have that, etc., etc. So that's the first part. The second part is the way that we coordinate the work between us, and actually with PCI DSS version 4, it's much more evident that it has to be done. There are even calendar invites, for having this process check pre-booked from like the last PCI audit. So the way how we're tackling this is it's like a two-pronged approach. One is through a ticketing system, and the other through actual calendar, appointments, to make sure that things are not being missed. That's how we are kind of attacking the
I suppose that applies to both the technical and the non-technical requirements,
true.
Right?
So with regards to definitely, so the technical, basically, we are making sure that the tickets assigned for the technical processes are actually triggered also for the human triggered processes. So when it comes to ASV scans, they are being basically scheduled automatically. When it comes to actually pen tests, we actually keep track of either major changes that would require a pen test, or else we have the regular pen test being actually triggered. So these are part of our business, so you cannot really miss out.
Of course. Okay. Conrad, in your case, again, like as we said, you are part of you manage an operation that's already PCI certified, but you also had the pleasure of having to certify also branches and other companies you have in other, let's say, countries, right? So then all of a sudden the scope increases beyond, let's say, your local one, and then you set up another, or you have another entity in another country, that also needs to be certified. How do you approach something like this, where now you're talking about an environment that also grows geographically? Does it impact, let's say, does it impact the scope, first of all? And does it make it more complex to maintain compliance across these various jurisdictions, let's say?
So, so first of all, it's important that we have the base set up, kind of, where we are certifying PCI, and we are making sure that this setup has a lot of functions that many organizations can use, kind of, because like that we will have, when we're talking about PCI, we will have requirements that would be applicable once we certify the initial centralized setup. At first, so in the beginning it was hard. First time we did it, but with the help of you guys, it became easier.
So I suppose the first, the way you approach it is that from a technology point of view, certification is done at a centralized level, and then these other, let's say, satellite offices sort of thing are using a system that's pretty much is already certified, right?
Yes.
So the scope of these other locations is somewhat very minimal compared to the technology company, let's say.
Yes. So you try to identify where the overlaps are, and you try to put in as many overlaps as possible, so to speak. Because it doesn't make sense for a setup, for example, for a subsidiary to build its own setup, because like that, the PCI scope explodes at that point. So
but in terms of the certification itself, each subsidiary gets its own certification anyway, right?
It does. And it's kind of, when they show this to their clients, etc., they would need to put in their name on it, not on the centralized setup. But through the overlapping, through the reusability, it makes it not so much painful. So we have one main audit every year. That is quite painful, but it's doable, okay? Because with the right approach, with the right scheduling that you mentioned, so which is common, and which we use as well. But then it's like in our case, we have a lot of organizations who just need to comply with requirement 12, for example, because the remaining requirements, most of them would be applicable to the rest of the organizations, which makes it...
Yeah, and I think an additional point to remember is that you have the Kyte company has to be certified to actually, certify you in those regions as well. You can't just certify if you want to open up in, I don't know, India or China. The company has to be able to operate in that region as well.
Yeah, so the certification, of course, needs to, or the auditor needs to be qualified to do the work in those regions as well, which is something that, a consideration for anyone certifying beyond their local entity, let's say.
Yeah.
Very good.
Something which in the beginning, in the beginning it looked extremely challenging, but then when we worked it out, it was really, really possible, kind of, so.
Okay, so let's get into now the discussion of the new version, right, of PCI, version 4, which has caused quite a bit of a stir because there are quite a number of requirements that are different and challenging as well, I would imagine. So from your, Gabriel and Conrad, from your point of view, implementing version 4 or making, let's say, the transition from the old version to version 4, what were your main challenges and things that you had to plan for, and I suppose things that possibly you're still working on, because as we know, some of the requirements are forward-looking. But
exactly. So the first approach was actually identifying the gap between the 3.2.1 to 4, and actually jotting down and taking stock of actually where is the gap. So part of the preparation for version 4 was actually understanding what changed and what it means to us. So that took quite a time because I would say the PCI was always like the different versions were complementary, were like building up, and if you do them organically, you lose track on what's changing, right? So actually we made a huge effort to take a full stock of the key differences. The second part was actually trying to identify the best approach, obviously for alignment, and keeping in mind, the upcoming changes of PCI version 4. So what we did then, we had to this gap analysis a plan whereby we identify what we could do now in the short term and what we need to prepare for the upcoming PCI certification, which basically we are trying now to align more, for example, the scope to be better and clearly defined from each and every layer. So as with any IT infrastructure, sometimes infrastructure is provisioned with not clear boundaries, or there are areas that could not present themselves as clearly defined in terms of the documentation side, and we are trying to align this more so that kind of the gap is defined, and then anything around this gap is around this scope is basically clear. The last part obviously is the internal audit. So basically for this transition to version 4, we actually engage with an internal auditor to go through the processes, and basically we are actually now running a plan for alignment as an ongoing process. So we took this, I would say, gap from 3.2.1 to 4, also as a maturity upgrade in terms of how we do work internally. So this is kind of the approach we took.
More or less the same. We started the process because we knew that version 4 was like version 3.2.1 on steroids, kind of, because most of the items in version 3.2.1 are still there in version 4, bar a few changes. We had to start as early as possible in the process and look from a very high level to try to understand the potential gaps, the potential challenges, the items which we needed to work on, which take longer, kind of, to deploy, test, make sure that we are complying, etc. We created a project internally, so we could, list all the requirements where we required work, and we did an assessment to see how much effort was required for every requirement. We're still going because the process is quite lengthy, because there's a lot to take in, a lot to consider, a lot to test, etc. But overall, it needs time, but it's not impossible.
Yeah.
Kind of,
But there are some significant changes, I would say, and I'd like to bring Kevin in because from a technical point of view, I've taken note of a few that I think are going to not necessarily are the only ones that are new ones, let's say, but the ones that potentially could be the ones, let's say, that entities could struggle the most to comply with. So, for example, 3.5.1.1, Kev, previously we used to have a hashing algorithm and you just hash a card number, a PAN, and now hashes need to be keyed cryptographic hashes, right? So maybe you explain very briefly, because I have a few more that I want to go through.
Okay, so where you use hashing before, you now have to have a secret key as well when you're basically securing that data from when it's coming in for hashing, and then keying with the secret key, So basically you making sure everyone part of that transaction is secure and they're authorized. So authentication are part of that process.
So the hash now has to be part of a keyed encryption, and the key needs to be stored according to proper key management, right?
Correct.
So it's not just a simple SHA 256 and that's it.
Exactly.
Okay, another requirement 6.4.3, which is also a new one with regards to page scripts, right? This I know for a fact that some are having to resort to technical, let's say, tools to get this implemented.
Yeah.
So if you take us through maybe the requirement itself.
Yeah, so the 6.4.3, you're testing my memory now. So
that page scripts that executed in the browser needs to be managed and authorized.
Yeah, and so basically checking the integrity and again, keeping an inventory of those, what you're actually using, those scripts. You have to have a reason why these scripts are there. So basically, if there's a compromise or anything on those scripts, you have some kind of inventory against that. So you make sure everything is known to you, so there's no change in there as well.
Yeah, another one is with HTTP headers, 11.6.1. You need to have a, let's say, change and tamper detection mechanism deployed, another new one.
Yeah, these two, not so much hand in hand, but they kind of cross over in the requirement. So it talks about the payment page, and this one here is, so if there's any tamper evidence on the payment page, the personnel internally have to be also, informed. So somehow they have to be alerted of what's happening, so then they can take action against anything that's happened to that payment page.
Yeah. Another two very important and new concepts are the targeted risk analysis, right, which is a new concept. And even bigger than that is the customized approach, which is more on the reporting side. So maybe you take us through briefly what these are about, starting with the TRA.
TRA. Okay, so the targeted risk analysis is for those requirements what require a periodic or frequent kind of thing, what's to happen for a requirement. So basically, for instance, there is in requirement 5, where we're talking about not at-risk systems such as Linux systems for viruses, so malware. So you need to have complete a TRA to evaluate how often you need to check for those systems that it still applies, they're not at risk from saying they don't need a malware installed on there, basically.
Yeah. So it's not enough to just say we are not affected by virus because of the tools that we use, but now we need to implement or draw up a risk assessment, and I suppose that's why it's called targeted risk analysis, a risk assessment specific on that, the issue that we're talking about, right? And you can have a number of these targeted risk analysis.
And there are a number in there, and luckily they're best practice till next year, 31st March 2025, I believe. So you need to complete the TRA form against each one, and then you need to complete, along with that, requirement 12.3.1, which gives you all the key points of what you must cover in that TRA.
Okay, and obviously one of the main prerequisites for the other new concept that was introduced is the customized approach, right? And the customized approach is a new way, let's say, of at least from your end, being the auditor writing the report itself is a game changer, right? But on the side of the entity complying, it's also a massive change in terms of how they need to prepare for compliance.
Yeah. So basically, for a customized approach is if you have an implementation, when I say not doesn't, where you're not meeting the defined approach, which is given by the PCI Council, the normal requirement, then you then can apply this customized approach to make sure you meet that requirement in the same rigorous way the requirement is asking. Now, it may seem easy, but you have a lot of work to do because you have to go through the forms which the council provide on their website, and you have to then look at that method, go through it, test it rigorously through, and then on top of that, it's just to cover the customized approach in terms of if we're doing the assessment, you can't turn and say, if you're not meeting the defined approach, then say to yourself, oh, we can't meet the defined approach, let's do a customized approach. It's not meant for that purpose. It's meant for the purpose that you have a mature process internally, you've thought through the process of that approach you're going to try and implement, and then me as the assessor, I'll evaluate that, do a test plan to see the test you've done, and to cover a test, I need to make sure it's covering the requirement. However, there is a bit of a clause to that. So if you get stuck on implementing a customized approach, the assessor doing the audit cannot assist you, basically. So another QSA can assist. He can help you implement, but then I'll evaluate it separately, so there's no conflict.
So if I understood well, the customized approach is a new way of looking at meeting a specific requirement.
Correct.
When you cannot meet the requirement as stated in the normal, let's say, defined approach, but you're meeting it anyway in another way, possibly in a better way, but because it's not exactly as stated by the requirement, you have to complete let's say, the customized approach.
Yes.
Right? And it has absolutely, it's not the same, or it's definitely not interchangeable with a compensating control.
No, they're two different things. The
compensating control is when you cannot meet it, right? And then you have to come up with a number of other requirements that jointly and combined together meet the intent behind the requirement.
Exactly.
Okay, I said it. I said it instead of you. I've been doing this for a long time as well. Okay, very good. So yeah, there are other requirements, of course, as well that have changed, and other new ones that may be less difficult to implement. But I thought these ones were the ones that were causing a little bit of discussion. Moving on. Okay, so it's not just PCI, right, that you'd have to comply with. As a company, I know for a fact you have different flavors of PCI PIN, 3DS, and others, but also ISO 27001 and possibly other standards that you need to comply with and get yourself certified to on an annual basis. How do these integrate together? How are you approaching having to comply with all these requirements? And obviously making sure you don't go crazy.
Which is the most important thing. It's another very big challenge, admittedly. But when you look at the different requirements, PCI DSS, PCI PIN, we do SSF as well. There's ISO 27001, ISA 3402. Compliance requirements from customers as well, because they will do their risk assessments and they will, include all sorts of things that we will need to comply with, etc. There is invariably always, there are always common denominators, right? So if you're looking at the most common, you need to make sure that they are identified, they are well documented, and they are well defined. The likes of, I don't know, if you have change management, if you have incident management, if you have, access management, for example, you have policies for your network security, for your operating system security, or all the controls that need to be there, that need to be in place. The trick is that it's a trick. It's a method, kind of, that when we get audited, most of the time, we always present the same policies at the end of the day, and the same processes and the same standards, And then, of course, depending on the requirement itself. So if we're mentioning ISO 27001, there's a statement of applicability. And of course, whatever is there, you need to show that you're doing that, kind of,
But then the technical controls in ISO, obviously in NXA, are very much common.
Exactly,
and
because
overlap with PCI.
Yeah, because then, okay, at face value, from a high level, you start from the high level, but then when you go into the details and then auditors will come and they will ask you, show me how to do it. We end up showing not the same thing, of course, but if we're using, I don't know, we have a ticketing system, for example, to track our incident management, to track our access management, for example, you know, we would be using that method, the same control, you know, to show that we are complying with that control. Of course, I'm keeping it at a very, very high level.
Yes,
but
it's a bit more complex than that, but yes, we get you.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you very much. That's all the time we had for today. We could have continued talking for another hour. Thank you very much for joining us. Yeah, thank you. That was very, very interesting. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this edition, and we look forward to welcoming you on another edition of Kyte Talks.